Okay. So this is hold on. This is yes. This is on part three, particularly on giving an oral adjudication, how to improve giving OAs and feedback. So firstly, let's discuss what exactly is an oral adjudication. So this is the means in which judges explain to debaters, one, what their decision is, two, how they came to that decision, and three, weigh and compare the contributions of teams to explain and illustrate their decision-making process. Essentially, it's a narration of the thought process of how you or your panel, assuming that there is consensus judging, came to said decision. It's a culmination of your skill in tracking and decision making, and this is your output of the said activity of tracking and decision. This is where debaters score you as a judge based on your oral adjudication, and the oral adjudication in and of itself usually lasts for 10 minutes. So it's usually a 10-minute speech, but I do want to flag that 10 minutes sometimes isn't enough to extensively discuss the decisions or at least the exchanges between debaters, but judges do have to be wise in managing time. It's not necessarily bad to under time because even I under time sometimes when I feel like I've exhausted all forms of explanation. But you also have to question whether or not you're under timing because you've exhausted all points of discussion, or if you're merely just not analyzing or explaining your thought process and decision making process enough. In terms of like over timing, I think there's also like a healthy balance. Are you really exhaustively explaining things, or are you merely just dragging on the explanations to make it seem like you are exhausting all forms of explanations? I think it's like theoretically it sounds quite difficult to know what the balance is, but the best way in being able to assess whether or not you're over explaining things or under explaining things is by really listening to any of the previous oral adjudications that you've given. If you've never given an oral adjudication before, then I suggest you attempt to give one, like just watch a recording of the debate and then give an oral adjudication based on that, and then compare your oral adjudication compared to like another chair or to whoever chaired that round, or perhaps try to listen to that oral adjudication and try to compare it to all the previous OAs that you've ever listened to before, and try to see whether or not you feel like it actually explained your thought process, and whether or not it allows you to understand uh, why the decision is as so, and whether or not it is exhaustive or not exhaustive. So here on the screen is the metrics coming from the world's 2023 judge manual, particularly on how debaters judge or at least score you based on your OAs. So it's a scale from 1 to 10. Again, the scales always differ between different formats. Like in Austral's format, it's a 1 to 5 scale. But for worlds and as well as for BP and as well as for AP, it's usually a 1 to 10 scale, and it usually references these same metrics. So you have 10, which is exceptional. You can read through the specific what this specifically entails. If you read the judge manual, you can also take a screen cap of this, but I'll just go through it. 10 is exceptional, so this is like a flawless OA. It's accurate, it's reflected, people understand the OA and the justification and the discussion of the panel, assuming that if you are a chair grading the panel, is also reflective of that. You also use the same scale to give scores to panelists if you are chair. 9 is excellent, 8 is very good, 7 is good, 6 is above average, 5 is average. So 5 is the middle between the 10 and the 1. 4 is below average, and 3 poor, 2 poor, 2 very poor, and then 1 is abysmal. I want to posit that usually ones can constitute as conflicts for certain tournaments, particularly if debaters do give you a 1. But in those instances, it's usually Adj course discretion where they talk to debaters and ask them about the justification as for why they're giving a specific judge a 1 or why they're wanting to conflict a specific judge. There are many reasons as for why debaters might give a judge a 1, particularly if they're salty or if they just really do not agree with the decision and do not understand the OA and how the decision making process goes as follows. But that's the reason why we are consuming resources and me giving this lecture on trying to improve that trying to give advice or at least tips in improving oral adjudications, because it's quite sad to see sometimes when judges are scored really lowly by debaters, when debaters don't understand or not necessarily understand, when debaters don't appreciate the attempts to give the oral adjudication, or at least if it's merely because the OA was a little bit messy, then a little bit messy, and that might affect the quality and or at least the way that debaters interpret the OA. So I think being able to look at the speaker scale at least, or at least this judge scale, allows judges to reflect on how exactly debaters are likely going to score them, or at least what are the specific metrics or things to consider as oral adjudications are given. But that's also highly assumptive, or assuming that debaters even read this part of the manual, which they should be, but assuming good faith, they should be basing off their scoring based on these metrics as opposed to their own personal biases and vendettas. Anyways, how exactly do you deliver an oral adjudication? Because you have all these scoring metrics and you get that it's a 10-minute speech that should be explaining your decision. But it's a matter of being able to understand the thought process, or the understanding the process of how an oral adjudication is given. And it is from being able to understand that process where you start formulating means for you to improve on giving that OA. So there are usually two parts in delivering an OA. First is being able to understand the process of decision making. So this is morely focused on the theoretical aspect of delivering an OA. And secondly is verbalizing that process, which is the actual or practical application of OA delivery. First, let's talk about the process of decision making. This is my personal framework, but feel free to think of your own. But for the sake of this discussion, I think there are four main points of the decision making process. First is on information. The second is value and standards. The third is reference, and the fourth being the tipping point. So, firstly, on information, this is where you try to ask the question of what is the decision based on? So, and this is where you provide a recap or interpretation of the way the debate and its contributions were understood by both you and the panel. How information is received and interpreted by judges is dependent on how they track the interactions with the debate and its development. It's important to note that information is really just based on tracking the debate and enough, which we mentioned in part 2, right? But the way that information is being received by individuals is quite different. So judges might have different interpretations of the information or the contribution that debaters are given. That's the reason why there are instances where judges have different decisions, because the way that information is being perceived by them, by certain debaters, or being perceived by them can change or at least affect the way that they make that decision making process, because of what is the information that they're working with that influences them to make that decision, or at least interpretation of information highly differs. When you're a chair, ideally you should be able to understand what your other panelists are or how your other panelists are trying to interpret that information, especially in BP judging, because the way that you're discussing the debate in and of itself is not just reflective of your own thought process, but also the panelists. So just being able to understand based on the interpretation of information, how, or at least how judges interpret it, is quite helpful. This is usually reflected when judges give specific recaps on different parts of the debate. How they recap a specific part of the debate can quite differ from one another. And that's where you start to see the subtleties of how they interpret information in the first place. The second part that should not be information. That should be values and standards. Sorry. The second part is values and standards. And this is where you question what are the priorities and interests of the debate. What are debaters and teams prioritizing when it comes to achieving goals, impacts, or catering to specific actors? What are the judges' values being applied or influencing you and your fellow judges to rank one team over another? And what values and metrics do you essentially plan to use and arbitrate in the debate? So remember in the first part, we were talking about the different metrics and values that you can use to adjudicate a debate, such as mechanization, the characterization of frames, the way that teams engage with one another, etc., etc. So those values and metrics, those values and standards, those are things that you already have to consider even before you make your oral adjudication, particularly in being able to ask yourself, considering that the information is being given to you, what standards or what exactly are you likely going to value based on the different priorities and interests illustrated in the debate, or at least the priorities and interests that debaters were trying to push, at least in the debate as it happened. So it's really just like being able to understand what exactly debaters are trying to say, what exactly are the goals that they're pushing for, what exactly are the priorities that debate should be focusing on, and then trying to extrapolate what are the metrics that you can arbitrate these different comparatives on, or what are the standards in which you would likely weigh certain contributions or certain material with one another. So that's on values and standards. That should not be information, that's values and standards. The third part is the reference. So you have information, and reference is particularly trying to question what stands out from the information in and of itself. And it's a combination of your values and standards and trying to reference or trying to see that information in the first place. Usually when you have your tracking notes fixed, and you have like a clear understanding on what metrics and standards you're going to use based on your decision, or to base your decision on, for that matter, this is where you try to combine and reference or reconcile your tracking and your values and standards. So the reference part of the decision-making process is like a filtered version of the information you receive during the round, where you highlight the information in the round that pushed you and or your panelists to be swayed, considering whatever values and standards that was being imposed. So this is essentially an assessment of the comparative between teams, and it essentially asks a question of what stands out that makes another team better than their opponent. So if you have all the information coming from the debate, right, different contributions, this is a question of what specific contribution or what specifically did the team do that met those standards, those metrics that you or your panelists ended up using to arbitrate the debate on, and how did they do it better in comparison to their opponent, who also tried to do the same thing, who also tried to meet those same standards, but the degree in which they met those standards or those metrics that you are trying to arbitrate the debate on isn't as exhaustive or isn't as great to a degree as opposed to whoever you're giving the win to. The fourth part of the decision-making process is the tipping point. And this is essentially a question of why is this a decision? Note that it is not enough to discuss that this is a decision and that you came to it. You also have to explain and reflect why specifically that is this decision. It's similar to how we treat debaters. Even if debaters explain to you an argument, if they do not tell you why exactly it's important for the round or why it's important for the debate, the extent in which it is credible or the extent in which you can value its significance is highly dependent on how you personally end up trying to interpret the significance, or depends on how their opponent engages with that debate of which one is more important. And that just leads to like relatively messy outcomes, and we don't want that. I think like just being able to explain the importance of your decision or explaining the importance of certain metrics and why specific contributions were more valued over the other can be extremely helpful in just improving an OA, because if like, at least from my observations, I think this is one of the things that judges, like newer judges especially, miss. Even I miss this sometimes. Particularly, I get so focused on being able to recap the contributions and then explaining recap the contributions, and then saying that, oh, these metrics are the ones that I applied, therefore considering all the contributions I just recap, that means that they won the debate. You shouldn't be ending your decision making process there, or you shouldn't be ending your oral adjudication there. You need to be able to explain why exactly that was the decision and why exactly the metric had to be applied. So for example, you have to answer the question, why is the metric of mechanization something that you consider in your decision? Why is the way X team ran the analysis better than their opponent? How come that was what swayed you to decide and give them the win? It's also a matter of being able to tie back to the motion, or at least explain the significance of these metrics and the comparative or point you're basing your decision on. So this is where you answer the questions as for why was this so important that it became your decision? Why was it important that it swayed your decision? Really, it's like being able to assess and explain the impacts of what teams did in a round and how their contributions met those metrics and why that was important in swaying the decision. So essentially, it's being able to answer the question of why. So just a general recap on the decision-making process. When you make a decision, you usually do four things, or you go through four steps, which is one is the information. So this is like the tidbit, add a question that you ask yourself. What will the decision be based on? How is the information interpreted? Second is on values and standards, and this is where you question the priorities and interests of debate, or at least how debaters explain to you the priorities and interests of debate, and what exactly are the values and metrics or standards that you plan to apply that would sway or that makes you weigh certain contributions over the other. The third is the reference, and this is where you question what stands out and who did that better. So this is where you do your comparative assessment based on the information given and applying the values and standards that were initially thought out and used. And then fourth is the tipping point, and this is where you answer the why. Why is this a decision? Why are these the points being referenced? And why are these metrics being used? After you are able to understand the decision-making process of not just yourself, but also debaters, this is where you discuss or at least this is where you start to verbalize the process. And similar to debaters, it's quite, the structure of verbalizing the process is like similar to, or the steps in verbalizing the process is quite similar to how you give a debate speech, which is firstly on providing the argument or providing the recap discussion. The second is being able to discuss the evaluation or the analysis of whatever the argument is. And then third is crediting, where you discuss the importance of it. But I'll get more into that now, actually. So these are questions that you can ask yourself. So in the argument or in the recap part of verbalizing the process, this is where you answer the questions. What is the contribution launched by teams? What did they say? What did the other teams say in response or contributed to such discussions? Did they agree on something? Did they disagree? The second part of the verbalizing the process is the evaluation. How well did teams prove their impact and or analysis? How did other teams respond, and what does that response do? What contributions will you be assessing to justify your decision or get to your decision? And then third is on crediting. Why are these contributions that you are assessing or basing your decision on? What about other contributions? Why are the others less important? Why are these the standards and metrics that you are applying to debate? Or why is X a better comparative than Y? I think these three steps in OA delivery consider all parts of the decision-making process, but it's not necessarily the way that you structure an OA per se. I think it's about the verbalization of this process is just to mimic, it's like trying to condense all the parts of the decision-making process and using similar structures that debaters use so that they can easily understand the thought process that you're trying to explain to them. Overall, it's important that OAs are reflective of how you and your panelists saw the debate. After all, as noted before, the way that information is received, valued, and referenced changes and affects and the way that you make your decisions. The better you're able to verbalize your thoughts and the process in which those thoughts were created, the better your OAs will be understood by debaters. And even outside of debate, I think just being able to verbalize how you think of things, whether that's to your friends or to your to your family or to whoever, generally just makes it quite easy for you to either persuade other people or make people empathize with you. So this is just on the process of the OA delivery, but So I just want to make a clear difference. Verbalizing the process of your thought, verbalizing the thought process is like these three steps. These three steps in OA delivery is not the actual structure of the OA. I mean, it is reflected in the actual structure of the OA, which we'll be getting on to the next slide. But I'm talking about like how you should be perceiving OAs and how you should be perceiving the way that you deliver OAs. If you are a debater yourself, then this is probably going to make sense to you. But if you are someone that isn't as well versed in debating, it's a matter of think about it as verbalizing the process in a way that mimics the way debaters speak, and it just makes it more digestible for debaters to understand or at least be able to level with you in terms of understanding the thought process, because not everyone can understand people's thought processes. So the way that you verbalize it can really change the way people understand how you got to certain decisions. Same way for debaters. So yeah, that's it. How do you structure an OA? And this considers all the things that we just talked about. So I think the process of verbalizing an OA is different from structuring an OA, because structuring an OA is quite arbitrary depending on whoever is judging in and of, or whoever is delivering the oral adjudication in and of itself. But the process of verbalization is quite similar, or at least the same for most people, in terms of being able to discuss or answer all those questions. So I mentioned some of these in the previous part, particularly in the general overview of adjudication, but I will be going more in depth on the specific structures for this. So firstly, you have the decision. Even in the World's Manual, the newly updated World's Manual, they do recommend that decision comes first. Then you have the general comments. Again, this is not required, nor is it the priority, but it's usually used to contextualize what judges saw in the debate, particularly the common problems or flaws applicable to most, if not all, teams in the round, and how said things affected the quality of the round. The third is the evaluations or metric standards. This is where you have to signpost and flag to debaters what were the standards that you used to assess the debate. And this is where you explain why were the metrics to assess the debate and applied to the debate. Yeah. Then you get to the big part or the big chunk of the oral adjudication, and this is where debaters are mostly going to base your score on, which is the justification. This is where you explain and integrate the idea of recap or the argument, evaluation, crediting structure of an OA or the crediting process of an OA. It can be issue-based, clash-based, or done through team ranks, etc. So issue-based, what's a question or contention that teams had with debate? How did they answer such questions? And then discuss how X team better answered that said question. For clash-based, it's you questioning what's a contention or disputed discussion in the debate. How did teams navigate through the dispute, and why is X team best able to either resolve or prove or win their side of the contention? In terms of team by team ranks, justification looks like directly comparing teams by relation to one another. So if you think it was an OOCG, CG, OOG, CO win, the structure of your OA would look like comparing why O had to get first place over CG, then why CG had to get second place over OG, and then why OG had to get third over CO. It could also look like discussing what happened in the top half, closing half, and then the diagonals, making it a six-way comparison. I also want to note that the structure of justification is highly dependent on your preference, but I do encourage that you explore and find the most comfortable option for you, as long as it helps you explain your thought process in a much clearer way. I think go do you as for how you structure an OA. So, yeah. By the way, if you have like confusion between the difference between an issue-based and clash-based, I think the best way that I could summarize it is the issue-based OA or the issue-based justification usually centers on a question or usually centers on questions. So if it was a feminist debate, the issue that you might use in an oral adjudication is, where do women get better female empowerment? Where are women happier? So it's like a question, right? As opposed to clash-based, where it's quite apparent what the versus is, or what teams are specifically contending on. Like if similar discussion of like a feminist debate, as opposed to saying where do we get better women empowerment, the clash might look like choice versus something. Sorry, choice versus something. What is another comparative for choice? Choice versus happiness, or for example, it could be like representation versus prop representation versus accountability, or perhaps it could also be like internalized oppression versus liberating limits. So the difference between the two is really issue based is more of like a bigger question. Clash based is more on the contention or what specifically are the two materials or two impacts that are being compared with one another, and how do teams prove those things. So there's like a versus in the clash based versus issue based where it's more of a question thing. Yeah, just to clear that up. The last part of structuring an OA is the tipping point. So right after the justification, you have to tie back to the metrics or standards that you initially posited and discuss why all the things you noted in the justification were the tipping point for your decision in relation to said metrics. How is the justification applying the metrics initially flagged? How come these were the things that tipped and swayed the decision for the round? Why were these the most important in the debate? Things like that. So that's on structure of the OA. The next part is on control. So on housekeeping. So there are two parts to control. Firstly, on housekeeping, judges don't only listen to debates, they also mediate and control them. So if a debater is being rude and making it difficult to listen to a current speaker, housekeep, call order. If a debater is overtiming, cut them off, stop writing notes, remind them of the time. If there's mandatory POI, enforce it. Interrupt the speaker by the 6 minute, tell them to accept the POI. Especially when you're the chair, how you housekeep a debate can influence the way debaters see you and your future OA. And this eventually sets up the mood and stage even before your oral adjudication is given. So I think the way that I can best illustrate this is if you were a debater, how would you perceive a judge who seems to be meek and unsure with themselves when cutting speakers off to enforce a mandatory POI versus a judge who has no qualms in doing so? As sad as it to say, the control that you execute and illustrate in housekeeping around, or even just your body language and facial expressions, can influence the way debaters see you to be someone that is credible or someone that they might think is questionable as a judge. So how you housekeep around, especially if your chair, is already reflective of the control that you have, but it also sets precedents or at least the tone and the stage in which you're going to provide your oral adjudication. Like if you control the house quite enough, or at least to a certain degree, debaters are likely to be more, I don't want to say pliant, but for a lack of a better word that my ESL brain cannot think of, pliant is probably the word that I'd use. Pliant when they listen to your OA, as opposed to like if you are someone that is not necessarily housekeeping or not necessarily controlling the house as much as you should be as the chair, and you seem very meek or very meek, where debaters feel like or get the sense that they can walk over you, the likelihood of them disrespecting you or the likelihood of them not wanting to listen to your OA because they don't think you're credible, because they think that you might be a new judge, is higher in propensity while you're doing your oral adjudication if you don't exert that extent of control. So just from housekeeping, you need to be able to exert a level of control, especially if you're chair. For a panelist, you don't really have this problem of housekeeping unless necessary. Like, I don't know, if the chair disappears, then the panelist has to be, usually gets promoted as a chair, right? But generally, if you're a panelist, I think you just consider your facial expressions, things like that. The second part of control is the actual delivery of the OA. So beyond housekeeping, control can also refer to a judge's confidence when delivering an OA. Do you have control of your voice and intonation? Do they extensively weaponize their language to their advantage? How does their control over language translate to how debaters perceive and understand the justification? The reason why I mentioned tone and language here is the way that you speak can really change the way that debaters and generally people perceive your language or perceive the speech that you're giving. Like there's like if you watch other debates, you can notice how the different manners of people particularly debaters, can really change up whether or not you perceive the speech to be emotional, whether you perceive the speech to be something where there's just so much matter, you just have to take note of it, that's it, or it's really making you empathize with a particular actor or it pulls on your heartstrings. It's the same for judges. The way that you control your voice, the way that you control the language and uh, how you're saying things can really change up the way debaters perceive your oral adjudication and your decision. If you say it with such dictatorial language, like, or very harsh language, this is where debaters are likely going to react quite negatively, especially those who are salty, especially those who cannot admit that they took the loss. So what I mean by dictatorial language, it's like, this is what debaters should have done. Or, oh, I think CG or CO was a rehash. Like those types of harsh languages. It's not to say that we should be debaters, but language really helps in ensuring that debaters don't come after you or don't feel as attacked, especially debaters who lost a round and who really feel like they shouldn't have lost that round. It really helps being able to tweak language in a way that sort of caters to debaters. So if you're trying to say that the closing theme is a rehash, the better way of saying it is, I think closing was relatively reminiscent of their opening insofar as explain how they were reminiscent or explain in that regard how they were a rehash. Or if you're trying to say that the round is messy because teams just didn't engage and you're just not sure how to arbitrate it based on those frames, rather than saying the debate was messy because because no one was engaging on each other's frames. The way that you could talk about it is to say that it is difficult to judge a debate considering that teams were operating on their own frames and they weren't extensively engaging on one another, or at least being able to weigh which frames to opt into or which frames that the debate should be operating on. So the difference in language can really change up the way debaters are going to feel like they're being attacked and therefore might respond in a way that is aggressive to you when they ask for personal feedback or start scoring your OA, versus like the reaction of them believing that, this OA makes sense. Like, okay, I get it. Maybe I should be improving on XYZ things. So keeping note of language is quite important. Same thing with tone. Like, depending how harsh you say things, it could also change the way whether debaters should react negatively or positively. If I will mention this in like the fourth part, which is on self-regimen, but the way that language usage, especially for judges, could be improved is, I think one way to do it is really just practice on essay writing, because the way that you write influences the way that you speak, in the same way that the way that you speak influences the way that you write. So trying to build up on words, or if you know those TikToks where they say, how do you professionally say something? Yeah, you can watch those things and try to apply that, or try to think about how that could apply to a debater sense or to a judge sense. So, sorry, that was like, I ended up going on a tangent about language. But yeah, when judging, control is important as it determines how credible you look and sound to debaters. The moment the debaters think that you don't have things put together, the less likely that they're going to believe your justification and opt to question your decision, and may even give you flack if they're just really mean or salty about it. The same extends to other panelists and judges. So like if you are a panelist, if you seem uncredible or if you seem like you don't have your things put together, sometimes you have judges or chairs that are just like, why? Why are you not put together? Why are you not giving me the justification of your decision? Or why are you taking up so much time? You cannot avoid the fact that people will stutter, that people will have to think about their notes first or think about the debate first and reflect before that they are able to verbalize that process. But the way that is being perceived, or the way that you're playing that off, such as your body language, your expressions, can really affect the way that judges or at least other people perceive you. And again, that is sad, but it is unfortunately true, at least based on my experience. You can contest that if you guys have different experiences. but I'm providing that here because I don't want anyone to experience that. If you feel like you don't have confidence, understandable that you can't make confidence out of nowhere. But at this point, it's the first thing that we ever learn in debating is always fake it till you make it. It's also applicable to judging. Fake it till you make it. Fake it till you perceive like you got your uh you have everything put together. So yeah. Control as a judge is also sort of like political power in playing politics. As weird as that parallel sounds, it's quite, at least in my eyes, it's quite similar. No one will listen to you if you don't create the environment to be respected, or if you portray yourself to be someone that can be easily walked over. So TLDR control is like asserting dominance. Control is also could also refer to the social skills or how you navigate an inherently power trippy scenario and experience. So, like, do you crack under pressure, or do you dominate, or are you the healthy balance of assertive and concessive? Uh, the ideal is to be the healthy balance. I think generally power tripping, whether you're a chair or whether you're a chair or panelist, is bad. Like the experience of being power tripped as a panelist is bad in and of itself. But when you're the chair and you are power tripping, you just make the problem worse, and that is just not a good thing. What I mean by power tripping is like if you're a chair or like if you're a panelist, the experience looks like the chair just blatantly ignoring you as a panelist, or blatantly talking over you to give you no purview of being able to justify your decision or being able to contribute to the discussion. That's not a very good judging experience, in the sense that it makes you feel really bad about the debate. It makes you feel really bad about the panel discussion. So as much as possible, we want to make it a safe space. We don't want that power tripping scenario to happen. But panel deliberations are is quite a power trippy experience, in the sense that there's a lot of politicking that goes on. So a healthy balance of being able to control and assert dominance in those scenarios or in that experience is just generally being assured with yourself and your decision, and trying to be, or at least being diplomatic in how you word things in your OA, or when you justify a decision during a deliberation, or how you navigate panel deliberations in the first place. So I remember back in Madrid, I was talking to other judges that I got to befriend online and that I got to befriend in Madrid. And we were talking about different ways on how to control or how to navigate through that power trippy experience. So, like affirmative action type of things, where if, for example, it's an international tournament and there's quite like the minorities are usually the POCs or the NCMs, the non-cis males. Usually, if they are chair, they usually end up trying to ask NCMs or POCs first, so that they can have they have the first priority, essentially, when it comes to being able to discuss their justification or how they perceive the round, and then later on moving on to different panelists, just to avoid that scenario of being talked over, or just to avoid that scenario of feeling that they're being left out because of the power trip or the inherently power trippy scenario or experience of panel deliberations. So when you control the room, when you control deliberations, and when you control yourself as a judge, whether that's in your oral adjudication or deliberations in and of itself, it must be done with intent. You need to be able to try to understand what are different externalities that can affect the way that people perceive you and perceive other people, whether that's in terms of housekeeping, as we mentioned earlier, or within the deliberations in and of itself. So that's on control. Then we have feedback. So this is like at the latter end of this discussion. This is also known as personal comments. So I'm going to talk about two types of feedback. Firstly, in terms of giving the debaters, and then second is being able to receive feedback for your OA. So when giving feedback to debaters, you ought to prioritize feedback that you didn't get to mention in your OA or didn't get to expound as much. The reason why you ought to be able to do this is I think debaters appreciate if you do not parrot your OA from feedback. So don't just give them a replication of your OA, but rather give them something new so they know what specifically to work with, or give them something targeted So they know at what point do they need to improve on within their speeches or within the case that they provided. Reference material and contributions that you didn't highlight as much in the OA, explain why they didn't extensively affect your decision, or at least why it wasn't sufficient enough, and then give them suggestions of how it could be improved. So giving personal feedback shouldn't stop at just saying that this is something that you can improve on because of XYZ things. You could also try to suggest to debaters how they can improve it. And you might think that when you suggest things, this assumes that you have to be the better debater over the other person, but really it's not. I think as a judge, the way that you perceive personal feedback is not to be afraid saying that you're not a great debater and that's why you're not going to give suggestions or recommendations on how they can improve. But it's trying to verbalize instead what you think could have been better or what you think could have elevated their speech if they did a specific something. Because you already at the point in which you understand the thought process as for why you made the decision, this is where you're also able to understand the process or the other externalities and different things that affected your decision, right? And if you are able to pinpoint what affected your decision, then you can possibly pinpoint what are things that they could have done to meet those specific externalities or those specific influences that could have swayed your decision in their favor. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that you have to be a better debater in order for you to give or suggest points of improvement or points of feedback to debaters. Quite contrary, I think it's much better that you have a bird's eye view, not being a debater yourself, but at least being able to understand your thought process and then discussing how your thought process could have been influenced if debaters did something different or did another thing in addition to whatever they did in the round. Giving feedback also should not be one-sided, and this is where I discuss the second part of feedback. You should also try to ask for debaters if they have any questions regarding the feedback that they're looking for and ask them for feedback for your OA as well. And usually when you ask for feedback on your OA, there are two responses. Usually it's good, and then that's the end of the feedback. And the second response, which is the ideal response, is they'll tell you what you think about the OA, what they think about the OA, and then they actually give you points of improvement or points of feedback. So I just want to posit, at least here in the Philippine circuit, getting judge feedback is quite difficult insofar as you don't really see your judge feedback from tabulation sites. At best, you see your scores, but usually judge feedback in and of itself isn't published. Or sometimes your scores as a judge isn't even published at all. And that is like the most frustrating thing ever. At least when I was on my journey of trying to improve as a judge, that was the most frustrating thing to me because I wasn't able to quantify how exactly I was improving. But secondly, it was so difficult for me to be able to understand what I should be improving on without having like a coach or without having another person who wasn't part of the debate to observe my oral adjudication, and then they would tell me their comments or I would ask them for comments. And that is so frustrating. But at least with the trend of online debating, I think like at least now the Philippine circuit is more open in being able to provide feedback to judges, or at least it's easier for you to message a debater or message a team and then ask them what you think of my OA. But unfortunately, that's not like common practice. At least I don't think so yet. I think there are still judges that still are hesitant on asking for feedback from debaters, which I understand why to a degree, insofar as if debaters are salty, you have to question the quality of feedback that they give you. But I think at the point in which the Philippine circuit is at now, I'm speaking for the Philippine circuit because I don't know how else it applies to international circuits. At least when I was judging in international tournaments, I was still receiving feedback from other people as opposed to in the Philippines, or at least when I was, in the Philippines, very hard and very difficult to get feedback without being proactive. But anyways, the points of improvement, regardless of whether or not debaters are salty about it or are very biased because you gave them the win, I think it is perfectly fine. Take any feedback that you can, considering how scarce it is for judges. At the case that the response is the former, where they just say it's good and that's it, you have to be proactive in asking questions. Be proactive, particularly if they just say it's good. Ask them, what specifically do you think I did in my OA that made you think that it was a good OA? What do you think that I could have improved on? Things like that. Just so it becomes more targeted and you know what specifically to replicate in your next OS. But secondly, it's also so that you are able to identify what you need to improve on or what you should be changing up in the next or future OAs that you have. So if you have been training as a judge before, I think you've received the advice that another way to train as a judge is giving an oral adjudication, listening to that oral adjudication, and then redoing that oral adjudication based on whatever comments or things and insights that you've thought of as you listen to the previous recording of your adjudication or your OA. But there's only so much that your personal feedback can do, or that you yourself are able to give feedback to yourself, versus like hearing feedback from debaters. Because your subconsciousness, yourself is biased to yourself in the sense that whether they just generally just do not like your OA because you're the type of person that self-loads, or you might be very confident when in truth that there are things that you could be improving on, or perhaps you were just short-sighted and you weren't able to see the different parts that could have been improved on. So getting feedback from debaters and from other people is quite helpful because you get to see a different perspective on how your OA is being digested and perceived. But secondly, it's just it gives you a starting point as for where you should be improving or where you should be fixing your oral adjudication. I remember when I was training for PIDC 2021, I used to think my OAs were so bad. And then when at one point, like during a training round, like where I was judging like senior members and the coaches were there, they were like, the OA was pretty good and solid. And I was like, what? Was that a good OA? I don't think so. I think that was like an average at best. So like your personal bias can really work against you, or it could work out for you, but more likely it's going to work against you. So getting feedback from other people, especially debaters, considering they're the ones that are at the end of the oral adjudication or receiving at the end of the oral adjudication, it's quite helpful in being able to understand that what are the different parts that you should be improving on. If you get like feedback that's quite salty or quite biased, like quite apparently biased, because either you notice that debaters either didn't listen to your OA, and that's probably why they didn't catch a specific part, or perhaps they're just really mad about your OA because based on the decision, I say take it with a grain of salt, but still take it regardless. So if you are aware that there are certain biases interplayed, don't just completely dismiss the feedback. Take it with a grain of salt in the sense that even if this person is like giving me flack, or even if this person is like biased because I gave them the loss, there are ways that you can improve your OA in a way that you can make that response less aggressive coming from debaters. And the way that you try to make that less aggressive from debaters is trying to intake the feedback that you got from all the biases from those debaters, and then trying to see what you can tweak and what you can fine-tune to be able to address those biased concerns, quote-unquote biased concerns, because they're still concerns regardless. And there is a reason why they might have thought that way. So always try to think and assess, and try to even re-listen to your OA and see how exactly the comments and feedback coming from debaters apply in the first place. But if it comes to the point where debaters are fighting you on your decision, I think that's where you have to like cut the line. This is where you hardline say no, in the sense that there's nothing that debaters can do to change your decision once you already gave your decision, fill out the ballot, and give your oral adjudication. But secondly, the extent in which debaters are salty, right? If they say that, oh, you just didn't understand XYZ contribution, things like that, it's not usually a you problem. It's more or less the way that debaters execute something. Like they had the intent to execute it in a specific manner, but it ended up not being executed as well. So that could affect the way that you interpreted the information, the way that they were trying to execute something. So like if it comes to the point where they're starting to question your abilities, where it starts like them heckling you, this is where you just end the discussion and might as well go to approach equity or AdJcore about the concern of these debaters. But if it's like just asking for feedback and you see that there are certain biases, like take it with a grain of salt. As long as they're not like being rude to you, as long as they're not being like super fighty with you, that should be fine. Certain degrees, certain levels to it. But the idea behind it is it's always a learning experience. Never take feedback as a bad thing. Okay? Even if debaters say that it's good, like don't just end it as there. Always try to fish for things that they think that you could be improving on. Like the bar of being able to get the perfect 10 is quite high. As far as I can remember, I've never gotten a 10 in my life. And I guess like if you're AdJcore, maybe you get a 10, but I've never gotten a 10 in my life. At most a 9. And that's where usually when I get a 9 or when I get higher scores, this is where I'm more intent on being able to ask debaters what specifically I did wrong or what specifically could I improve on to be able to fine tune and make sure that I can higher the score. In the same way that if you think it's an average OA, well, what exactly could you do or what are the things that debaters wish you did to make the score a bit higher? So I don't want to say it's you being greedy, but it's you being more intent with asking questions as for what specifically you could improve on, what specifically debaters like so you can replicate it again, and then what they wish that you could do in future OAs that could have allowed you to get a higher score. So things like that. So that is the end for this lecture. For this part of the lecture, the last part is going to be on self-improvement, where I talk about training regimen and everything beyond. So yeah, thanks.